Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate to you the common faults that you might see when you're taking the Department of Health backflow assembly test exam as related to the pressure vacuum breaker. So again, I'm going to be testing a pressure vacuum breaker. I'm going to set up a fault simulation here. Alright, and so I'm going to notify, identify, inspect, observe. I'm going to make sure that I'm testing the pressure vacuum breaker. It says pressure vacuum breaker on here. Got a flow, direction of flow area, arrow, shut off valve number 1, test cock number 1, shut off valve number 2, test cock number 2. So I'm going to purge my test cocks, or flush my test cocks. So flush test cock number 1, flush test cock number 2. I'm going to replace my compensating valve. On test cock number 1. I also need to make sure I remove the canopy. Hook up my high side hose. Maybe. Oh, come on, you little. Okay, hook up my hose to test cock number 2. I'm going to open up my test cock, which will drive the gauge. Test cock number 2, which will drive the gauge to the upper end. I'm going to make sure all my other valves are closed, and I'm going to purge my hose and my assembly, or my test kit, sorry. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, well, I'm going to close shut-off valve number 2. And remember again, the first thing you test is the air inlet valve. So I'm going to elevate the test kit to the proper height, which is up here. I'm going to close shut-off valve number 1. And to test the air inlet valve, I'm going to slowly open my high bleed valve. Alright, I'm going to open it up just a hair more. Okay, well, I still got a pretty good stream of water flowing through my test kit, coming out my hose here, and my bleed valve's open. And you notice that my pressure isn't really going down, and you know, something's going on. Well, what's going on is that I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. Obviously, I've got water coming into the body of the assembly from somewhere. If this is installed properly, the only place it should be coming from is shutoff valve number 1. All right, you can also verify that by essentially checking to see if it's shutoff valve number 1 by opening test cock number 1 and see if water, you're basically doing the same thing you would with a compensating valve, but you know, opening this compensating valve isn't going to do anything for me if the test cock isn't open. So I'm going to open the test cock slowly and see what happens. Well, notice that water continues to flow out of test cock number 1. Again, that's an indication to me that I have shutoff valve, a leaking shutoff valve number 1. So I would say, Proctor, I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. In which case the proctor would say, problem's been corrected. I would open up shutoff valve number 1 just to make sure the pressure's right. I would purge my test kit again just to make sure it's right. I'm going to elevate to the proper height here. and I am going to now test cock, or excuse me, I'm going to test the air inlet valve opening point by slowly opening my high bleed valve. Alright, this time my gauge is dropping, so I know it's not a leaking shutoff valve. Well, okay. Remember, the minimum opening point is 1 psid. I'm waiting, I'm observing my gauge, I'm looking at the gauge movement, the monitor. I've got my finger on the gauge, or on the air inlet opening. Something doesn't seem right here. Well, it's still going a little bit. Alright, I'm going to open my bleed valve just a hair more. Alright, just a hair more. Remember, don't open it too much. Well, my value on my gauge, or my gauge, has gone below 1. So this is not meant the minimum value. And in fact, if I open up my bleed valve a little bit more, I actually get my gauge to go to 0, in which case this would indicate that my air inlet valve is stuck. So always remember, on air inlets, whether it's on the pressure vacuum breaker, or as we'll show later on the RP, 0 equals stuck. So my air inlet is stuck. Alright, so I'd say Proctor, my air inlet is stuck. In which case the Proctor would say, problem's been corrected. I would set my test kit down. I would again open up shutoff valve number 1 to repressurize everything. I would purge the assembly. Okay. Elevate. Isolate. I gotta check something. Elevate, isolate, and test the opening point of the air inlet valve. So I'm going to again open up my high bleed valve. I've got water coming out the little holes like it's supposed to be. I'm going to observe my gauge. Gauge is dropping like it's supposed to be. Alright, I'm going to face it towards me for a second so I can see the reading. Okay, my air inlet valve opened up at 2.8 psid. I'm going to close my high side bleed valve, remove my high side hose, set the kit down, observe that my air inlet valve is fully open, and I would state that to the Proctor. Proctor, my air inlet valve is fully open. I'm going to close test cock number 2. I'm going to re-energize the assembly. I'm going to hook my high side hose up to my compensating valve. I'm going to pressurize everything by turning on test cock number 1, which pressurizes my gauge. I'm going to purge my gauge by opening up my high side bleed valve. And I'm going to test my check valve. So again, I'm going to elevate the test kit to the proper level, which in this one the proper level is here where the water will drain out. Okay, so I'm going to elevate, I'm going to isolate, and I'm going to test by opening up test cock number 2. Well, what gets me is even though my test gauge has gone down, it's not going down any farther. I've still got a pretty good stream coming out of my test cock number 2. I think I've got water coming into this assembly. So I'm going to double check by, in this case, because this test cock is open and because you do have the high side hose hooked up to the compensating valve, I can open up my compensating valve. And when I do that, the amount of water flowing out of my test cock has gone down. My air inlet valve did actually pop open. Okay. I can also, at this point, if I close this, because my air inlet popped open, I get enough water to flow out of the air inlet valve, but not enough volume to actually get it closed. So at this point I could say, Proctor, I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. And again, just like on the double check valve, because you're opening and closing this, it could possibly that your shutoff valve holds when you do the air inlet valve, but then doesn't hold when you do the check valve. So in this case, I would say, Proctor, I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. Proctor would say problem has been corrected. You're going to want to close test cock number 2. You're going to want to re-energize the assembly, repressurize it, purge everything, elevate, isolate, and test. So now my gauge is going down like it's supposed to. The air inlet opened up like it was supposed to, but hey, wait a minute. When I look at my test kit, the gauge has gone below 0, or excuse me, I always keep saying that, gone below 1. Minimum value is 1. At this point, I have a failed check valve. I don't have to wait for this to stop. I know already I have a failed check valve. So I could say, Proctor, I have a failed check valve. Proctor would say, problem has been corrected, in which case you would close test cock number 2. You would re-energize the assembly. I would purge everything again, just to be on the safe side. Okay, elevate, isolate, and again you're going to test the check valve by opening up test cock number 2. And again, you always got to remember the conditions for testing a check valve are that water stops flowing and the gauge is stabilized. So we're going to sit here and wait a minute for the water to stop flowing. Oh, it's getting close, I think. And again, this is an exercise in patience. So there we go. Water stopped flowing. I can now read the value. My value is 1.9 psid. So check valve holds tight at 1.9 psid. In which case I can set the assembly down, close test cock number 2, close test cock number 1. I like to put the canopy back on before I turn it on, just so it don't get waters everywhere like it before. So I've got shutoff valve number 1 on. I'm going to open up shutoff valve number 2 to get my customer back in service. I don't have the test cock closed completely. So I'm going to make sure I've got all my equipment removed, got the canopy back on, customer back in service. So I am done testing the pressure vacuum breaker assembly. In the real world, I would fill out my test form completely, accurately, and legibly, and that would conclude the test. like I said, hopefully the proctor will say, which assembly do you want to test next?